morning, students. Yesterday we started this chapter on the Mongols, and we saw yesterday in the initial lines that yes, normally the Mongols definitely had their nomadic origins, and they still are very proud to be known as the nomads. Even if you go to Mongolia today, Mongolia is still very much is not about an urban life or a sedentary life at all. Okay, whether it is the life of men or it's life of women. The moment you come out of the Mongolian capital Ulaanbaatar, you see and you would understand that they, most of them, live the same kind of life that which their forefathers and their ancestors lived. Of course, they have far better access to technology than, of course, what their ancestors had. But then you have to understand that for a student of history, it is not the information on Mongols doesn't come easy. Okay, because ultimately they did not record most of the stuff, what they did, the kind of life they lived, about their social structure, about their festivals, their gods, how they interacted among husbands or wives or children. All that information, to the extent which we would appreciate and which would make things easy for a historian to understand and to study those people, that is very lacking, because they ultimately were, in the end, they were nomads, right? They were more busy enjoying the nature around and then having fun with their life, rather than just documenting, so that 400 or 500 years later, people would be interested to know more about them, and it would be passing on that information. These things were just not that they were bothered about. Okay, so coming to today, starting this paragraph, whereby perhaps, and that is why perhaps the most unlike the nomads, whether in Christian world, the Roman world, or the Arab world, those people used to document everything meticulously. Okay, everything was documented, unlike the Romans, and unlike the Mongols, who were just not interested in that. And that is perhaps and that is the reason why perhaps the most valuable research on the Mongols was done by Russian scholars, starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Tsarist regime consolidated its control over Central Asia. Now, Tsarist regime, students, means the king of Russia. The king of Russia is known as Tsar, or rather was known as Tsar. So what they are saying is the Tsarist regime, that means here the Russian king. This work was produced within a colonial milieu and was largely survey notes produced by travelers, soldiers, merchants, and antiquarian scholars. In the early 20th century, after the extension of Soviet republics in the region, a new Marxist historiography argued that the prevalent mode of production determined the nature of social relations. It placed Genghis Khan and other emerging Mongol Empire within a scale of human evolution that was witnessing a transition from a tribal to a feudal mode of production, from a relatively classless society to one where there were wide differences between the lord, the owners of the land, and the peasant. So, what we see here is, as the complexity of the Mongols kept rising, so did the class structures, uh, because now the class structure was being formed, which otherwise had been non existent in any nomadic civilization or a society. Because nomads, everyone is having, in a nomadic society, everyone has the same stake, because you keep moving from one place to another. Like today, you are in Masuri, tomorrow, you are in Dehradun, probably after 3 days you are in Ponta Sahib. Then the point is, you do not own resources at all. You keep moving. You're always on move. So naturally, you would not be having a system of a bureaucracy and a system of a king and his aristocracy and his council of ministers and the clerks who keep the records and then the peasants. Definitely, those structures are complicated, and then you have those complicated structures only in a setup which happens to be a sedentary setup, right? It would not be a setup where the population keeps moving here and there all the time. Because then there is no concept of owning of resources. The only thing you own probably in a nomadic society is your livestock. It could be cattle or horse or goat or camel, whatever it is, right? So coming to this, the last paragraph here, the transcontinental span of the Mongol Empire also meant that the sources available to scholars are written in a vast number of languages. Perhaps the most crucial are the sources in Chinese, Mongolian, Persian, and Arabic, but vital materials are also available in Italian, Latin, French, and Russian. Often the same text was produced in two different languages with different contents. That's very possible. For example, the Mongolian and the Chinese versions of the earliest narrative on Genghis Khan, titled The Secret History. Just a moment. Yes, the secret history of the Mongols are quite different, and the Italian and the Latin versions of Marco Polo travels to the Mongol court do not match. Uh, Students, you have to understand that's what it is. Because Mongols were ruling over half of the world, the known world at that point in time. So naturally, Mongol Empire was in China, it was in Russia, it was in Iraq, it was in Iran, it was in India, so naturally different sources would talk about, would write about different things. For example, something which would be documented by the Iraqis would be different to what would be documented by the Chinese, and that would be different what would be documented by the Central Asians or the Russians. So that is what they are talking about. And even here it is said, different Italian and Latin versions of Marco Polo's travels to Mongol court do not match. uh, that is Marco Polo. You have to understand he's one of the very famous travelers of all time. Marco Polo is a very famous name, students, much before people like Christopher Columbus and Magellan and Bougainville. They became legendary names. So before them, Marco Polo was considered to be the gold standard of international traveling, if you may call, in the Christian world, and Ibn Battuta in the Arabic world or the Islamic world. Yes. So that is what it was, and that is what they are saying, that different people had, and different sources talk about different things. So guys, this map is a very important one. Please remember this map, okay? And I tell you in all my videos that yes, map would be extremely important, guys. If you are a history a student, then it's very difficult to understand history without proper understanding of the maps. You must have a good understanding about map, not maybe not completely, but yes, at least 80% of it is important. Only then you would be able to connect the dots. Introduction. In the early decades of the 13th century, the great empires of the Eurasian continent realized the dangers posed to them by the arrival of a new political power in the steppes of Central Asia. Steppes is the grasslands. Genghis Khan had united the Mongol people. Genghis Khan's political vision, however, went far beyond the creation of a confederacy of Mongol tribes in the steppes of Central Asia. He had a mandate from God to rule the world. Even though his own lifetime was spent consolidating his hold over the Mongol tribes, leading and directing campaigns into adjoining areas in North China, Transoxiana, Afghanistan, Eastern Iran, the Russian steppes. His descendants traveled further afield to fulfill Genghis Khan's vision and create the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was the spirit of Genghis Khan's ideals that his grandson Monge won the French ruler Louis the Ninth in heaven. That heaven there is only one eternal sky, on earth there is only one Lord, Genghis Khan. the Son of Heaven, when by the power of the eternal heaven, the whole world from the rising of the sun to its setting shall be at one in joy and peace. So these were not empty threats. The paragraph below it, and empty threats, and the 1236 to 41 campaigns of Batu, another grandson of Genghis, devastated Russian lands up to Moscow, seized Poland and Hungary, and camped outside Vienna. Vienna is Austria. And in the 13th century, it did seem that the eternal sky was on the side of the Mongols, and many parts of China, the Middle East, and Europe saw in Genghis Khan's conquests of the inhabited world the wrath of God, or the anger of God, and the beginning of the day of judgment. uh, because students, as you would see in this chapter, that Genghis Khan's and the Mongols, they were very, very ruthless during their campaigns. Okay, they did not spare anyone. The modus operandi, or the mode of operation of the Khans was of these Mongols, was to just first, before attacking any empire or a kingdom, they would send a message that please surrender. Otherwise, if you don't, and once we enter, then we won't spare anyone. And then there used to be a whole scene of hell, because they would be ruthless and they would not hesitate to butcher the youngest of children and women, unlike some other expansionist empires where they did not like murdering and killing children and women. But Mongols didn't have they didn't have, they were not discriminatory, if I can put it that way. They had the same treatment meant for all. So, social and political background: the Mongols were a diverse body of people linked by similarities of language to the Tatars, the Khitan and the Manchus to the east, and the Turkic tribes to the west. Some of the Mongols were pastoralists, while others were hunter gatherers. The pastoralists tended horses, sheep, and to a lesser extent cattle, goats, and camels. They nomadized in the steppes of Central Asia, in a tract of land in the area of modern state of Mongolia. This was and still is a majestic landscape with wide horizons, rolling plains ringed by the snow-capped Altai Mountains to the west, and arid Gobi Desert in the south, and drained by the Onon and Salenga rivers and myriad springs from the melting snow of the hills north and the west. Lush, luxuriant grasses for pasture, and a considerable small game was available in good season. Right, the hunter-gatherers resided to the north of pastoralists in the Siberian forest. So, students, basically ideal conditions for being nomads, right? Ideal conditions, population very limited, and then enormous amount of geography. Even Mongolia today it's a huge country. Okay, though a landlocked country, it doesn't have a sea coast, but it's a huge country. And Mongolia's Gobi Desert happens to be the world's largest cold desert. Sahara happens to be the world's largest hot desert, but the Gobi Desert in Mongolia happens to be the world's largest cold desert. We shall continue, students. Thanks.